Welcome to the 11th episode of Masters and Matches with me, Peter Doggers.
And me, Arne Mol.
Arne, today we're going to talk about one of the greatest tournaments in the history of chess in general, which was AVRO 1938, a tournament with the world's top 8 players in one group and nobody else. Amazing history and looking forward to this episode.
Yeah, me too. It's a very special tournament in more than one regard. I think it has not been rivaled in terms of how strong it was until Norway Chess 2017. By the way, a tournament where we were both present. You were a journalist and I was a spectator. And during that tournament, I was very much inspired by the AVRO 1938 tournament because it turned out that Norway Chess was, also featuring basically all the strongest players in the world. I remember Magnus Carlsen, I think he came almost last. Kramnik was there, Caruana was there, Aronian, he won the tournament. And it reminded me very much of AVRO 1938. And in fact, I wrote an article at the time to link the two tournaments to each other. And that was very memorable. And I think there are definitely parallels that we will touch on when we talk about the AVRO 1938 tournament, which was held in the Netherlands.
Yeah, let me start with mentioning those top 8 players. Who are we talking about? Who were playing this tournament? It was Aljechin, Botvinnik, Capablanca, Euwe, Fine, Floor, Keres and Reshevsky. So 2 former world champions, Capablanca and Euwe, and 1 reigning world champion, which was Aljechin.
Yeah, so it sounds like the only former world champion who was still alive, who was missing, is Emanuel Lasker. He was already quite old at the time. I think he was quite annoyed that he wasn't invited, right?
Yeah, afterwards he expressed that. He wrote here and there that he felt he could have been there and he maybe should have been there, but at the same time, I guess the organizers were thinking, Lasker, 69 years old at the time. Let's invite some younger player of younger generations instead. But only 3 years before, at the Moscow 1935 tournament, Lasker had come 3rd place at 66 years old, which was described as some kind of biological miracle.
Yeah, he was still strong at the time.
Yeah, so I don't think he would have been necessarily finished in last place, but who knows?
So maybe to start with a little bit of background in the chess world, as we typically do for these kind of events. Aljechin was the world champion, as you mentioned already. He had beaten Euwe in the return match the year before in 1937. And the situation was still quite unclear who was actually the strongest player, I think, although Aljechin was the world champion. There were already talks a couple of years before to have FIDE organize some kind of candidates tournament to decide the challenger of the world champion for the match.
Yeah, I think it was Euwe himself in 35 when he won the title. He was maybe the first world champion who felt like the challenger should actually be somehow arranged by this newly founded International Chess Federation, right? Because it was founded in 1924. It wasn't even that old yet.
Yeah, maybe he just didn't want to play Aljechin again. Yeah, also interesting to mention, the tournament was held in the Netherlands, like both matches between Euwe and Aljechin. And the chess was definitely a very popular game in the Netherlands. So it was kind of logical that it was also held in the Netherlands once more, this very strong tournament featuring all the best players in the world. And it was organized by a radio company called AVRO. It's still existing actually right now. But back then radio was a relatively new phenomenon. So it was a kind of an obvious sponsor, I think, for the tournament.
And say a little bit more about that status of the tournament. We were mentioning, suggesting that this FIDE should play a bigger role. But what was the background of that? Basically we had decades of a different situation where the world champion could basically sort of choose his opponents. And everything kind of depended on whoever could bring up the biggest sum of money, at least a sum that the world champion was agreeing to play against this player in that case. And Euwe was sort of saying, I don't really mind that. Let's just get a good challenger. But then he lost the second match to Aljechin, and Aljechin had a bit of a different opinion on the whole matter. He kind of agreed to Euwe's idea, but not in full. And his official clause in the contract for the AVRO 1938 tournament said, Dr. Aljechin declares himself ready to play a match for the World Championship against the first prize winner of the tournament upon conditions and at a time to be arranged later. However, Dr. Aljechin reserves the right to play first against other chess masters for the title. So, yeah, it's kind of clear that he must have sort of enjoyed playing those two matches against Bogolyubov and getting some money for that. And he didn't want to be deprived of the right to maybe do one or more of those matches, right?
Yeah, and I think there's also definitely some conversations that he was a little bit afraid of some other potential candidates. Not in the least Capablanca, who was already relatively old, but still really strong.
Yeah, Capablanca still wanted to play Aljechin, and he really, basically from the moment that he lost to Aljechin in 1927, he really wanted this rematch. And this is described quite well in the book AVRO 1938 International Chess Tournament, where Dale Brandreth writes, Capablanca had apparently only realized Aljechin's true strength, dedication and stamina during and after their titanic match in 1927. By 1928, the Cuban had, in order to re-establish his eminence and to demonstrate that he was the only rightful challenger, already started to play in many more tournaments than in the first half of the 20s. But yeah, as said, after that, we see two World Championship matches between Aljechin and Bogolyubov that, nobody really takes that seriously. And then, Aljechin loses the match to Euwe, wins back the title in 37, and still no chances for Capablanca, and he was still hoping for it.
Yeah, he was, I think, also trying to negotiate with Aljechin at various moments, but Aljechin basically always backed off.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll return to what happened to, let's say, the World Championship cycle after discussing the tournament in the section, the aftermath of this AVRO 38 tournament. But back to the tournament itself. And the schedule, the grueling schedule, I might add, especially for those two oldest players, Aljechin and Capablanca, I guess, because it was really rather remarkable. Arne, what was the situation with the playing halls?
Yeah, as most listeners will probably know, even if you're not living nearby, the Netherlands is a really small country, and therefore you could think, well, how long can it take for a train to go from A to B? But if you look at the cities that they were playing in, you still realize that it might have not been so easy to reach all those cities quickly from, let's say, Amsterdam. And it must have been really, really tiring for the players to travel by train every day to a different city and then back, of course. This is really unusual.
Yeah, exactly, because this is also what sort of was copied from how the Euwe-Aljechin matches in 35 and 37 were organized, where also players kept on playing their games in different cities in the Netherlands. And this happened again with the AVRO tournament. So to give a few examples, first round, November 6, 1938, Amsterdam. But then 2 days later, they had to play in The Hague, which I would say is at least an hour by train at the time. And then 2 days later, Rotterdam. And 2 days later, Groningen. But that's all the way on the other side of the country. And I would assume in those days at least 3 hours to get to Groningen.
Yeah, and I think the adjourned games were even played in different cities once more, right? So if you had an adjourned game from the previous round, you still needed to travel to a different town.
True, yeah. There is a schedule in one of the older books that we checked. And for example, the third round on Thursday, the 10th, was in Rotterdam. But on the next day, on Friday, the adjourned games were supposed to be played in Amsterdam. But then the next day, they had to play the actual round again in Groningen, as I mentioned. So it was actually pretty crazy.
It's crazy.
And the other thing to note is that and it's probably related to having to make all those train rides, that the times to play, it was on working days between 6 and 11 p.m. and on Sundays from noon to 5.
Yeah, and this was not without consequences. I think some players, notably Aljechin and Capablanca, who were a little bit older than the rest, were really not happy with this schedule and also not with the times. And I think both of them complained. Here is a quote from Aljechin, where he also mentioned this. Can a tournament carried on under absolutely new and abnormal conditions be considered a sufficiently solid basis for the exact determination of the comparative strength of the participants? Stated in this way, the question can only be answered in the negative. Chess masters, some of them getting on in years, were forced, without sufficient warning, to play in a tournament of exceptional difficulty, continuing for 3 weeks without a single day's rest, and to play day after day in a new town. This was absurd and cannot be agreed to in the future.
Yeah.
Harsh words.
Yes, and I don't know actually if it was ever repeated later on in tournaments.
I don't know.
I mean, I know much later. The first thing that comes to mind to me was that at the last few years of the Linares tournament, half of the tournament was held in Morelia in Mexico. But of course, that was only one half in Spain and then the other half in Mexico, or the other way around.
Right.
So still not a lot of traveling in between rounds. But I can't think of And actually, in Norway, they used to have some chess also on a beautiful flower island in Norway at Norway Chess. But it could also have been that was the location of the Blitz tournament. So I'm not sure anymore. But yeah, I don't think this crazy schedule was ever repeated in chess, to be honest.
Definitely not. So let's talk a little bit about the participants. We mentioned them already briefly, but maybe worth looking a little bit more in detail at where they were in their chess career.
Yeah, let's do this alphabetically, and I'll start with Alexander Aljechin, 46 years old at the time. Some of you might have seen sometimes that Aljechin has been photographed with a cat and known to be a cat lover. And yeah, when we were researching this tournament, it was also mentioned somewhere that he arrived in Amsterdam with his 2 Siamese cats. And also a funny detail was that he was staying in the Carlton Hotel on his own so that he would not bump into Capablanca. So that speaks a lot about the relationship between Aljechin and Capablanca, who, we always feel like there's a lot of chess matches in history that never happened, and the return match Aljechin-Capablanca should definitely have happened, and Capablanca really wanted it, but yeah, they were not on speaking terms. However, he was the world champion at the time, Aljechin, and there's an interesting impression about Aljechin in what was written at the time in the Dutch newspaper, De Telegraaf, about Aljechin and how his opponents were sort of seeing him. And yeah, I think it's really still is a little bit the same as how the chess players these days look at Magnus Carlsen. This Dutch journalist wrote, Aljechin still is the chess emperor, certainly in his airs. One senses this at once when one sees him in the midst of those other great players, such as Reshevsky, Keres, Floor, and Fine, who surround him as a crack regiment of vassals, when he is in the lounge of the Carlton Hotel, as the press put a number of questions to him. Floor, Reshevsky, and company listen as pupils before their teacher.
So the next player is Michail Botvinnik. He was the promise of Soviet chess, I would say, and he had already won 2 USSR championships. He was actually educated as an engineer, and he had won the tournament of Nottingham 36 together with Capablanca. This was a very prestigious tournament, and it also won Moscow 1935. So he was already very successful, but not yet the world champion, obviously, but one of the outsiders, except for the world champions.
Yeah, and Moscow, he was a co-winner with Floor, and together they, as mentioned, they finished just ahead of Lasker, who had this great last tournament of his career. But moving on to the third player of the tournament we're talking about today is José Capablanca, the former world champion from Cuba, and well, arguably one of the best players still at the time, right? He was supposed to be still absolutely world class, although he would not perform very well. We're going to talk about that later. He was 49. He would actually turn 50 years old on November 19, the 9th round. And fate had it that round he was actually going to face Alexander Aljechin.
Yeah. So the next player to mention is Max Euwe, the Dutch former world champion. He was 37 at the time, still, of course, very strong, very energetic, always looking for sharp pedals. But he was also an amateur. He was a teacher at a girls' school in Amsterdam. So he combined his work with a chess career. And I think he was really keen to become one of the top contestants in this tournament.
Next on the list, Ruben Fine, 28 years old. Did not have a very long chess career, actually. There's a lot of these players, almost all of them, who actually had other occupations. Owe as a teacher, Botwinnik having a different background as an engineer, and there are other players like that. But Ruben Fine would eventually be educated later after the war as a psychologist. But he was still playing a lot of chess in the 30s, and actually he was really strong in those years. Interesting to mention also, he was really hard to beat at the time. He was the only player not to lose a single game in Nottingham 36 and also Semmering 1937. And he was at the time living in the Netherlands as he was married to a Dutch lady. And one more note about Ruben Fine is, many players might also remember this name from some of the famous books that have been written in the 1930s and 40s. He was the first world-class player to edit the classic opening guide, Modern Chess Openings. And also his 1941 book, Basic Chess Endings, has been always, for decades, has been regarded as one of the great endgame books.
So the next player is Salo Floor. He actually turned 30 during this tournament after round 10. And he was not playing great, but that can, I think, be explained by the political situation at the time. So 1938, this was actually the year in which Germany invaded Czechoslovakia. And Floor was a Polish-Ukrainian Jew. I think he must have felt very strong pressure. Well, that's probably an understatement from the situation in Eastern Europe, and he must have been very worried about his family or maybe even himself.
Yeah, I actually found a last-minute prep for this podcast. I found a funny detail about Floor, who was living in Czechoslovakia at the time, that he was actually really famous in the country, and his name was used to sell many of the luxury products of the time, including a Salo Floor cigarettes, slippers, and eau de cologne.
Wow.
Yeah. Also a very strong player. He won Hastings 3 times in a row in the early 30s, and as we mentioned, he was the co-winner of Moscow 35 with Botwinnik.
Yeah, then we come to Paul Keres, one of the biggest chess heroes of the 20th century, one of the ones who never became a world champion, unfortunately. He was the youngest participant. He was just 22 years old. Old by these standards, I think, but still at the time considered to be a youngster. He had already had some great successes. He tied with Aljechin for first in Bad Nauheim, 1936. And he won the Semmering 1937 tournament ahead of Fine, Capablanca, Reshevsky. I think some people already considered him to be a potential future world champion. It's funny to note that he arrived in the Netherlands by train from Estonia, his home country, although he was provided a diplomatic passport to travel by plane. But he didn't do that. It was also the case that he was still studying, so maybe he was not prepared so well. There's actually a funny quip from an interview with him at the time. Keres was still a student. He was actually at the time studying for a mathematics exam, and a journalist from the Telegraaf asked him what kind of preparation does your second have with him? And Keres answered that he saw that his second had brought a old Bilger edition with him. That was a very old chess opening book, and basically he said, in the Bilger, at least in the latest edition, not much is to be found which is not known to any master. This is an old copy on which the late Reti has drawn his most beautiful ideas about the new romantic chess. So maybe he intended to play romantic chess.
Yeah, maybe he just wanted to be inspired or something.
Yeah.
Okay, next and last participant not yet mentioned, Samuel Reshevsky. The famous child prodigy in chess. We might all have seen once this photo of him, this black and white photo of him playing a simul as a very small kid against all the older men around him. But he was already 27 at the time. Originally from Poland, he had emigrated to the US in 1920, and he had been educated as an accountant. He came from New York on the Queen Mary boat to the Netherlands. And also as an interesting side note, he was when he was asked who was actually the favorite to win this tournament, his answer was, all have an equal chance. The differences in playing strength among the participants are so small that they cannot even be discerned with a telescope.
So let's talk about the tournament itself. It was held in the Netherlands, we already mentioned that, and the opening ceremony was on Saturday, the 5th of November, 1938, in the Amstel Hotel. Very famous hotel in Amsterdam, which still exists and is still very famous. Many celebrities have stayed there since. And the first round was played the day after, on November the 6th, in the Krasnopolski Hotel on the Dam Square. Still exists as well. And it's the same location where Euwe and Alekhine had played in 1935, the match for the World Championship title.
Yeah, I actually have also worked a bit as a chess journalist in the Hotel Krasnopolski for 2 or 3 years, because that was also the location of the Experience versus Rising Stars tournaments organized by or funded by the late Joop van Oosterom.
Yeah.
Where you had these great matches between, for example, a very famous game between Korchnaya and Caruana was played in this tournament.
Yeah, and I think also the Aura chess, the later versions of the Aura chess tournaments were held in Krasnopolski too. I remember that my grandfather told me that he visited this tournament back in the day. I don't know where he visited it. Probably must have been in the Krasnopolski, and I don't know which round.
You mean AVRO 38?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, he was in his early 30s back then.
Mm. What about the prizes that could be won there?
Yeah, so the prizes were, I would say it's interesting to look at it. So the first prize was 1,000 guilders. And that doesn't sound like much. And I mean, guilders were still around before the euro was introduced. And it's not a lot of money, but back then, if you calculate with inflation, etc., it would be roughly a year's salary for an average citizen. So that's a decent amount. Second place was 750 guilders. Third place, 500 guilders. So yeah, decent prize money at the time. For basically the strongest players in the world.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, what happened in the tournament, right? And who won it and everything like that. Well, we can start with the first 6 rounds, which was basically very similar to, for example, what happened in the San Luis 2005 tournament when Veselin Topalov crashed through the field. In 1938, it was the American Ruben Fine who started with an amazing score of 5.5 out of 6. Before he was finally stopped by Paul Keres. So that was halfway the tournament. He was leading with a 5.5 out of 7. And Keres did not start that well, but I guess he was one of the players who ended pretty well.
Yes, he had a super strong finish. And in the end, he tied together with Fine for first place. There's a very nice progression chart in one of the most well-known books on the tournament by Max Euwe. It's called Analysen, and at the very last page, it has a fold-out graph where you can see the progression of all the players in red and black, and it's really beautiful. You can see clearly that Fine had the best start, but then Keres caught up, and they jointly ended first.
Right. Some more facts about Ruben Fine is, for example, that he was the only player to take 2 points from an opponent, which was that he beat Aljechin in both games, the reigning world champion. Mm-hmm. And he had a minus score against only one player, which was Paul Keres, he's the co-winner of the tournament. Well, Keres was the only player to go through the entire tournament without a loss. He had 11 draws and a few wins.
Yeah, so maybe he didn't play everything in a romantic style, right?
These facts are coming from the magazine Chess Review, by the way, and they also had some funny statistics, such as mentioning that Euwe was the tallest competitor and that Reshevsky was the shortest competitor. Yeah, I mentioned before, probably linked to the fact that his family was in a very tough spot in Czechoslovakia that was invaded by Germany. Salo Floor ended in last place. And he lost the most games as well. He lost 5 games and was the only player not to win a single game.
Yeah, there are also some of these facts mentioned in the book by Euwe in the last section. For example, Reshevsky needed a second session after adjournment in 12 games. So that's really a long session. The longest thinking time in total was also for Reshevsky. He was known for his time trouble, I think. He spent in total 40 hours, 19 minutes and 44 seconds behind the board.
Yeah, well, indeed, one of the co-winners, Keres, had the shortest thinking time, 35 hours and 33 minutes. And yeah, when I'm reading this, I think that this tournament might be one of the or maybe the very first tournament where this time usage of players was actually recorded. Because, yeah, well, players were playing with the clock already, obviously. I think the chess clocks were sort of introduced in the late 19th century for most tournaments. And apparently it was, I think, the work of one of those really hardworking journalists of the Telegraph who were really paying attention and making a lot of notes. And they must have been sitting in the audience in the first row or something and really keeping track of everything that was happening.
Yeah, it's mentioned that Reshevsky for one move took 52 minutes. Right. That was the record.
And in the end, only 3 games were lost on time, but it doesn't say which players.
Yeah, so maybe let's talk briefly about why Capablanca played so poorly in this tournament. I think that requires a little bit of explanation. Peter, you already mentioned that he turned 50 during this tournament. And on his 50th birthday, he had to play against Aljechin. It was on the same day as the 27th match game of their World Championship match in Buenos Aires.
Also 19 November, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
11 years before, yeah.
So on the 19th of November 1927, he played against Aljechin. It was the 27th match game, and he gained a winning position. But he blundered, and he threw away the win. The game was drawn, and it was a very painful moment in the match for Capablanca not to have won. And he basically never recovered from that moment in the match. He had bad memories to the 19th of November, and that was not a good sign before going into this game with Aljechin. Capablanca had black, and he played the French defense, which he had really not done before in his chess career and was criticized by many people afterwards. And Max Euwe writes in his book that Capablanca played a really sharp move on move 3 against the Tarrasch line of the French that Aljechin employed. But if you look at the game, it's just the move knight f6 on the third move. So knight d2, and then Capablanca responded with knight f6, which is a completely normal move. So apparently at the time it was seen as very provocative. And indeed it's true that Capablanca was completely crushed in this game. Aljechin got a huge space advantage and basically never gave him a second chance. So it was a very bad game for Capablanca, and he never recovered really.
Yeah, and it also has been suggested that his health wasn't so great, and this might have played a role as well in this tournament. Which, it was a bad tournament for him, and as a player who didn't lose many games, to have 3 losses in the second half of the tournament was quite remarkable for Capablanca. It has been suggested in the Oxford Companion of Chess by Hooper and Wilde that he suffered a slight stroke during the event. And his wife, Olga, has recalled that his high blood pressure nearly cost him his life. She said, "A doctor screamed at me, 'How could you let him play?' And then in a 1939 interview, Capablanca attributed his performance to very high blood pressure and related circulatory disorders." Yeah, all this is coming from the Wikipedia page on the tournament, which kind of focuses on Capablanca's poor performance, actually. And it notes that it was also only 4 years after the tournament that Capablanca passed away, way too young as well, at the age of 54. So maybe his health was already starting to deteriorate at the tournament.
Yeah, there's another quote from Capablanca from a 1939 interview in which he mentions the following. "In the AVRO tournament, I played under physical conditions that were absolutely abnormal. Although I'm not up to date with chess literature, I played the openings well in all my games for the simple reason that I have judgment. But after the first 3 hours of play, I felt my head was splitting. It was impossible for me to think and coordinate ideas." By the way, it's funny that he mentioned that he is not up to date with chess literature, so he hadn't actually prepared much. but that he thinks that he's playing well simply because he's a good player, basically, right?
Yeah, and also apparently that game against Aljechin, that the opening went fine as well in that one.
Yeah, well, not really, I think. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about more really chess-specific topics, perhaps related to this tournament. For example, we can mention a little bit about what kind of chess openings were played in that event. We know that, well, around the mid-20s, we had this new period in chess that was called hypermodernism. And maybe that was what Keres was alluding to when he was speaking about Réti's romantic ideas. But also some other players, for example, Nimzowitsch, they were advocating these new openings where, you did not need to build a pawn center in a chess game. You could also, for example, fianchetto a bishop and use that to attack the opponent's pawn center later on, right? So that was a whole new idea of playing chess in the opening, actually. And it's interesting to see how that reflected, roughly a decade later in this absolute top tournament. And I do see that those new kind of openings like Queen's Indian and Nimzo Indian and even the Grunfeld Indian were played quite a lot, right? But Arne, you have looked at the games a little bit more than I have, but these were really new openings at the time.
Yeah, it's true. And if you look at some of the openings that we know very well right now, like the Sicilian, for example, or the Italian, they were not played at all. There were a couple of Ruy Lopez or Spanish openings and a couple of French ones, particularly by Capablanca. There was a couple of Queen's Gambit games and a number of Slav defenses, but indeed, there were quite a few modern and hyper-modern openings being played already back then. I think those openings came to fruition also during the 40s and 50s, so in that sense, the 1938 tournament was really a precursor of chess opening theory to come.
Yeah, for example, the Nimzo Indian was played 11 times and the Grunfeld Indian was played 9 times. So pretty impressive for that time.
Yeah.
And with a big tournament like that, with the 8 strongest players in the world, there were obviously also some very famous games played that will always be remembered in chess history. So Arne, let's mention a few of those games that are forever with us, right?
Yes, so I think to start with the most famous one, that's the game Botvinnik against Capablanca. It won the beauty prize of the tournament, and I think most chess players that are interested in this podcast probably also know that game. We'll come back to that in a minute. I wanted to mention 2 other games as well. One is the game Keres Capablanca from the 6th round, a very beautiful tactical attacking game by Paul Keres. And also the game Botvinnik against Aljechin from the 7th round. That is not an attacking game, that is a very positional game in the semi-terrace, where Botvinnik basically brilliantly plays an end game, which superficially looks like it could be equal, but it's really not equal. And Aljechin himself later said that it was the only game where I felt completely outmaneuvered. And I can really recommend to look at this game, especially if you're a D4 player or if you play the semi-terrace with black. It's really a game that you have to know to understand this opening.
Yeah, and then, a bit more, as we said, about that Botvinnik Capablanca game. For the chess players around us, maybe the mention of 30 Bishop A3 already rings a bell. It was a combination where Botvinnik sacrificed a full bishop just to lure away Capablanca's queen from the defense, and a few checks followed, and a dangerous pass pawn eventually won the game. But that is not exactly how Botvinnik fully experienced the game, I think. In fact, when he annotated the game himself in his biographical book about his best games, he was quite honest, sincere about his thought process before playing that famous combination. Arne, maybe you can quote him or describe how he talked about it.
Yeah, so it's a combination where he first sacrifices a bishop, then he sacrifices his knight, and then there are a number of checks, and then he plans to promote his pawn on e8, but he has to allow quite a few checks with the black queen, which look dangerous, and he had to calculate that he runs out of the checks, basically, but he really didn't. So he writes the following about 30 bishop a3. The beginning of a 12-move combination, including the following winning maneuver. I must admit that I could not calculate it right to the end, and I operated in 2 stages. First, I evaluated the position after 6 moves and convinced myself that I had a draw by perpetual check. Then, after the first 6 moves, I calculated the rest to the end. A chess player's resources, particularly at the end of a game, are limited.
Well, maybe they are particularly limited if you just had a 3-hour train ride before the game. But at the same time, it is a long combination, but because it's so forced with all those checks, it doesn't feel completely impossible to calculate it in full, does it?
Yeah, I think that position is probably given to talented students still as training material. And I wonder how many of the current top players could calculate this combination actually until the end. I think quite a few.
Yeah, exactly. I can already think about the theoretical section from a book from Dvoretsky where he's saying that his student Don Mato found it in 2 minutes and also improved upon the analysis while doing it, right?
Exactly.
Oh yeah, and another, what I also loved about the notes about this game by Botvinnik is that he mentioned, well, he has a diagram, obviously, before bishop a3, and under the diagram he writes, it is interesting to mention that during the World Chess Olympiad in 1954, in a shop window in Amsterdam, a cake was on display showing the position in the diagram. Chess players had remembered this game.
Wow. So for the preparation of this podcast, I looked again at my copy of Euwe's book Analysen, AVRO's Wereld Schaaktoernooi. And I played some of the games on my computer. And I must say that I was really impressed by the analysis of Euwe. He must have written them quite shortly after the tournament. I could not really find that many errors in his analysis. Even in the tactical lines, he seems to have grasped the gist of the position very well. He understood the direction of play and I think also how the players evaluated positions. So I was really impressed, Peter, if you remember in one of the previous episodes, we talked at length about Bronstein's book about Zurich 53, and I was quite critical of it. I cannot say the same about Euwe's book. It was really profound, and I think it has stood the test of time very well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that, I believe, shows, to be honest, also that Euwe was very serious in what he was doing. He was known as a very hard worker, and I think when he did something, he put really all his energy in it. And he was, and he was also an excellent analyst. I mean, also early on in his career, he was famous for his contributions to chess opening theory, and that also could only have happened as a result of hard work, I think.
Yeah, it's always funny with these kind of things. You sometimes do notice comments like, this is a really bad move in the opening, and then you check it with Stockfish, and it's actually the best move in the opening. So this always happens, but in general, I think his precision of tactical analysis is quite impressive.
Right. Before we move on to the aftermath of the tournament and what it meant for the chess world and perhaps the intended World Chess Championship cycle, I wanted to mention one funny kind of anecdote from another interview from the Dutch Telegraaf newspaper. Luckily, it seems Mr. Capablanca, who had just finished a very bad tournament, was again in pretty good spirits, and he was being interviewed by the journalist. He's also a very hardworking journalist, I believe. And in the middle of the interview, he suddenly said something like, "Well, actually, I have to talk to one of the organizers for a moment. So yeah, maybe you can ask my wife a few questions in the meantime." And the interview just continues, and the reporter indeed asks his wife, his second wife, Mrs. Capablanca, "You will surely be happy to depart for Paris again." And Miss Capablanca answers, "Please, I don't bother a great deal about that. I am fond of New York and the Americans. They are real sports. Always cheerful, never mean, and not at all chauvinistic. For the stranger, America is an ideal land. One doesn't enter there easily, but once inside, then one enjoys a freedom which in the Europe of this day is entirely unknown. And the beautiful thing is that the rich man, to be sure, has to pay much and expensively for his wealth, but for the less blessed, life is oh so cheap. You find there the most splendid cafeteria where one can get a really good dinner for $0.50. And then at some point, Capablanca is done with his talks with the organizer and comes back and interrupts his wife. And suddenly says to the reporter, "Did you know that my wife plays chess also? Nowadays, she even writes my chess columns. And do you know why she prefers to be in New York? There she has a rich brother-in-law with 10 cars. That's the whole difference."
So, just to recap, what was the final standing of AVRO 1938? In last place, it was Floor. He scored 4.5 points. Then Capablanca scored 6 points. On fourth place, jointly, we find Aljechin, Reshevsky, and Euwe with 7 points. Botvinnik, he came third, scoring 7.5 points. Fine and Keres, they were jointly the winner. They scored 8.5 points.
So yeah, great tournament with lots of amazing games and new developments in opening theory. And also one of those rare moments in chess history where the absolute top 8 faced each other. But let's talk a little bit more about the aftermath of this event, because, as we said, it was also kind of seen as sort of a candidates tournament for the world title, right?
Yes, and if you look at who were the most likely candidates for another championship match against Aljechin, these were Keres, Botvinnik, and perhaps also Reshevsky. Unfortunately, we all know what happened, right? After this tournament, basically World War II started, and another World Championship match with Aljechin and someone else never happened.
Yeah, right after the tournament, Aljechin himself had suggested that the next match for the world title should be against a representative of the younger generation, indeed mentioning Keres, Botvinnik and Reshevsky. And Botvinnik wrote about this part of his life also in his book about his best games, where he mentioned that after winning games against Aljechin and Capablanca, I took the liberty of entering into negotiations about a match with the world champion. That was right after the tournament. Our talk took place over a cup of tea, with Floor also present, at the Carlton Hotel in Amsterdam, where Aljechin was staying on his own so as not to run into Capablanca. And this is what we mentioned at the start of the episode. Aljechin agreed in principle to a match with me in Moscow, on condition that 3 months before the match he could play there in a training tournament. In January 1939, the Soviet government approved the organization and financing of the match. Correspondence started with Aljechin, but it was interrupted by the Second World War. In the autumn of 1945, Aljechin had an article published in the magazine Chess, where he confirmed his agreement to play a match with me. After it had been approved again by the Soviet government, negotiations with Aljechin were resumed through the medium of British chess players. It was proposed that the match should start in August 1946 at Nottingham. But on Sunday, 24 March 1946, the great chess master passed away.
Yes, and decades later, it was Reuben Fine who wrote another piece about this time, and particularly about the match that Aljechin was supposed to play. When World War II ended in 1945, all the leading masters of that day, incensed by his behavior, because he was collaborating with the Nazis basically, they objected to his participation in international tournaments. The Soviets broke the boycott by having Botvinnik challenge Aljechin for a match for the title in 1946. Actually, this was illegal, since Keres and I had prior claims. But Keres, born in Estonia, was a Soviet citizen, while I was no longer so interested.
Yeah, says a lot about the time and the power that the Soviet leaders had, right?
Yeah, very unsatisfactory episode actually in that sense. Not only because Aljechin passed away, but also because it was not really. It didn't end well, I think. And only when Botvinnik became the clear world champion, this situation was resolved.
Yeah, because as we all know, what happened in the end is that FIDE organized a World Championship tournament in 1948 between Botvinnik, Smyslov, Keres, Reshevsky and Euwe, which was won by Botvinnik. And after that, the chess world started in a sort of a more normal situation with actual World Championship cycles and candidates tournaments and zonal and interzonal tournaments and all that, and things became much more organized. But yeah, it was world champions who were handpicking their opponents initially, and there were also world wars that really caused a lot of turmoil. And there were, as I said, there were a lot of matches that were supposed to happen but never did. For example, another great miss is that Akiba Rubinstein never played a match for the World Championship, to name just one player, and obviously also Paul Keres. But Keres later had his chances in candidates events, but somehow, also never made it to a match, right? So, chess is full of stories of successes and also stories of failures. And then there are stories that never happened and should have happened, right?
Yeah, and I think if you look at the quality of play by both Aljagein and Capablanca in the tournament in 1938, you can say that they are both clearly past their peak. And there was a lot of talk of having another match between them, and I think especially Capablanca tried to lobby for that. But Capablanca was clearly past his peak. He was already quite old and not playing very well anymore, as he admitted himself. But also Aljagein, I think he clearly was not playing so good anymore. His endgame technique was not great, and I think he was also getting tired. Maybe it was because of the circumstances of this particular tournament, but I found it striking that he threw away quite a number of endgames that he really would not have lost maybe 10 or even 5 years before.
All in all, a very interesting tournament and a very, very strong tournament. It hasn't happened many times in chess history that the top 8 of the world came together and played each other in a double round robin. So absolutely great time for chess in those days. Great time for chess in the Netherlands those days. And let's hope that more of these tournaments at some point will return, right? We had Norway 17. We were both there.
Yep.
Do you think it will happen again ever?
I hope it will happen in Wijk aan Zee, perhaps back in the Netherlands, to have all the strongest players in the world compete once more, like in Norway 2017 and in AVRO 1938.
Mm-hmm. All right. Hope you enjoyed the episodes, and see you next time.
See you next time.